This video has been sponsored by Squarespace. I seriously doubt that any of us have managed to reach adulthood without hearing at least a few fairy tales. Maybe it was the story of Little Red Riding Hood, or Cinderella, or Jack and the Beanstalk, or maybe it was one of the many adaptations, spoofs, and edgy 2010 retellings that were inspired by those original stories. And not to stereotype you guys, but if you're watching this video, I bet you know that a lot of those modern fairy tales originated from the collection of the Brothers Grimm. Today, I want to take a deeper look at the life and times of the Grimm brothers, investigate some of their more obscure and perhaps disturbing stories, to try and pin down why they made it their life's work to study and preserve something as silly and inconsequential as fairy tales. Jakob Ludwig Karl Grimm was born on January 4th, 1785, in Hanau, a city in what we now know as Germany. Just about a year later, on February 24th, 1786, his brother, Wilhelm Karl Grimm, was born, and due to their closeness in age, the brothers were incredibly close growing up. They were basically twins, except that they shared the middle name Karl instead of the womb. While their family had never been particularly poor, their stations improved considerably in 1791, when the father of the family was elected Amtmann, which is basically a magistrate, of the city of Steinau. This gave them land to live on, a quite beautiful house, and a rather stable income. The brothers flourished in Steinau with private tutors to teach them reading and writing, a nursemaid to tell them stories, and the entirety of the German countryside at their fingertips. Okay, and I have been saying the German countryside, but technically where they were living was not Germany yet. This was before the unification of Germany, when the country was still split up into much smaller kingdoms, each with their own leader, still under the larger umbrella of the Holy Roman Empire, as they had been for over 1,000 years. I will be continuing to refer to the regions that would eventually become Germany as Germany, just for the sake of simplicity, but you should probably be aware that technically it was not Germany until 1815. However, it is interesting to note that the abundance of random small kings and kingdoms in the time of the Holy Roman Empire may have contributed to the environment of the fairy tales that the Brothers Grimm would collect and retell, where there's always a king and a princess and a castle. But their peaceful countryside upbringing could not remain peaceful. There was a lot of chaos in Europe at this time, the French Revolution was going on, and things were only about to get more chaotic in the personal lives of Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm. In 1796, their father died of pneumonia, leaving 11-year-old Jakob as the man of the house. Because their father, the Amtmann, was gone, they lost possession of the house they had lived in, and they got a very small stipend from the government in his memory, but it was not enough to support them. Their mother, Dorothea, was unemployed at the time, but they were able to just barely scrape by with a lot of monetary support from family members. Their greatest support would come from their aunt, who was wealthy enough to provide for Jakob and Wilhelm to attend a special school in the city of Kassel. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, but it did present its own unique challenges. Despite their private tutoring, educationally speaking, the Grimm brothers were far behind their peers, and compared to the other rich, noble boys that attended this school, they were country bumpkins. They stuck out like a sore thumb. And constantly pressing on them was this feeling that even though they were children themselves, between Wilhelm and Jakob was the responsibility of being the man of the house. Through hard work and a lot of focus, they managed to claw their way through school, becoming just as educated as their classmates, and in 1802, Jakob was accepted into university. While this was a great step forward for him, it also meant that for the very first time, the Grimm brothers would have to be separated. This was a heartbreaking blow for them. They had basically been connected at the hip since they had been born, and now suddenly they were entirely alone. We still have a lot of their letters that they exchanged from this time where they're expressing to each other the pure heartbreak that they feel being completely alone without each other. Jakob was doing quite well in university, but Wilhelm, who had suffered from scarlet fever when he was much younger, was constantly plagued by poor health. He was bedridden for a full 6 months, not allowed to read or write, only able to draw and to dream to pass the time. And while this was obviously quite difficult, Wilhelm would later explain how much this time of intense boredom would spark his creativity and his curiosity. Fortunately, the brothers were soon reunited as Wilhelm went up to university, and it was there that the two of them fell under the tutelage of Professor Friedrich von Savigny. Savigny nurtured the spark he saw in the brothers, urging them to be mindful and thorough in their scholarship, and pointing them in the direction of specifically German art, culture, and knowledge. This was at odds with the more classical university curriculum, which emphasized the study of the art and history of Rome and Greece, and Savigny was likely inspired by the growing wave of Romanticism in Europe. The movement known as Romanticism was just starting to pick up steam in the early 1800s, and it sought to do away with all pretension and get to the heart of what it meant to be human. The art and literature of Romanticism attempted to eschew the subject of the rich and famous and focus on simplicity, on the ordinary person and their very ordinary lives. They thought that in this simplicity, in going back to our roots, we might find some answers, some kind of universal truth that might guide us through rapidly changing times. This meant setting aside the tales of Homer and the wisdom of Aristotle, and instead diving into folk wisdom, into local history. Savigny would eventually request Jakob to be his research assistant in Paris, and Jakob dropped everything to take this opportunity, derailing his university career. And although this was a very risky move, everyone in his life, including his mother, approved of the decision. Somehow they knew that this was something that he needed to do. But as important as this stint in Paris would end up being to his later scholarly efforts, it also meant that the brothers had to be separated once more. And again, you can see in their letters the pain and frustration that being divided by space gave them. But by 1805, the brothers were together again, moving in with their mother and sister in Kassel, where they had first attended school. As joyful as this reunion was, their living situation was still as dire as ever. Despite their education, Jakob and Wilhelm struggled to find work, and tragically, in 1808, their mother, Dorothea Grimm, died. To make things all the worse, it was right around then that the French arrived in Kassel. The new French Emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, had been sweeping his way across Europe throughout the 1800s, and his armies reached Kassel in 1806. Napoleon positioned his youngest brother, Jérôme Bonaparte, as the new King of Westphalia, and Kassel was the capital of the new realm. And it was actually in the castle of this new French king that Jakob finally found work. Perhaps it was because he was the best one for the job, or perhaps it was just because he was the only academic in town desperate enough to take a position under their new French overlords. Jakob was given the job of being the royal librarian, caring for over 12,000 books in their collection. His only real job was to look after the books and to make sure that nobody but the approved people, the king, the queen, and of course himself, the royal librarian, was allowed to ever look at the books. And fortunately for him, the royal couple was not very much into reading, so he kind of just had the library to himself, and he had a lot of downtime. Meanwhile, Wilhelm's already fragile health was just getting worse and worse, so he was sent away to an experimental doctor for treatment. And when I say experimental, I really do mean experimental. He was fed pills that made him vomit. Every morning his neck would be rubbed with mercury, which yes, is incredibly toxic, which is what we now know, and they even played with the new technology of electricity, using a primitive car battery, basically, to run electricity through his body in the hopes of settling his heart. Wilhelm, understandably, didn't really enjoy these treatments, but he found refuge in this time in learning about the local folklore and folk music. And you know what? Something that they did to him must have worked, because eventually the treatments started to make him feel better, and he was able to return to Kassel and to his family. Still trapped under the thumb of the French, but with plenty of free time because of Jakob's employment and Wilhelm's continued unemployment, the brothers found solace in diving deeper into German culture. Inspired by Romanticism, they believed that fairy tales, the fairy tales of the German people, contained some kind of quintessential Germanness, and they thought that preserving the integrity of that Germanness would be key to preserving the spark in the hearts of the German people. Wilhelm would later describe it. When a storm or some other catastrophe sent from the heavens levels an entire crop, we are relieved to find that a small patch, protected by tiny hedges or bushes, has been spared, and that some solitary stalks remain standing. When the sun shines once again and favors them, they will continue to grow alone and unnoticed. No sickle will cut them down too early so they can be stashed in a large silo, but late in the summer, when they are ripe and fully grown, some poor and pious hands will come searching for them. Ear on ear will be carefully bound in bundles, inspected, and attended to as whole sheaths. Then they will be brought home and serve as the staple food for the entire winter. Perhaps they will be the only seed for the future. This is how it seemed to us when we began examining the richness of German literature in earlier times, and saw that nothing much had been preserved from that richness. Determined to preserve what was left of the storytelling tradition of bygone days, the brothers began to collect fairy tales. Now, the contemporary impression seems to be that the Brothers Grimm gathered these stories themselves, that they canvassed across Germany, going door to door, hearing these stories firsthand. But that's not entirely accurate. In certain special cases, they were able to do so, such as in the case of their neighbors, the Wilds, who were literally their next-door neighbors. They had 4 daughters who really enjoyed telling stories, and some of the tales that we get in the very first volume of Grimm Fairy Tales come from those sisters. And in some cases, the brothers had to get a bit creative about how they collected their stories, because not everyone was willing to give them up to some random academic. According to one account, they traded an old man his stories in exchange for a couple of pairs of their old trousers, and they actually stayed in communication with that old man, and he would frequently send them letters asking if they had any other used trousers that he could take, which I think is nice. And then in other cases, they would have to send in children to little old ladies to get them telling their stories, because the little old ladies didn't want to tell their stories to grown men. But for the most part, the Brothers Grimm asked other people for help. They sent out to their colleagues and fellow scholars, requesting that they record any snippets of folk tales that they might hear. Everything from the old washerwoman talking around the well, to the thief in a prison cell, and just about everyone in between. In 1811, they sent out an open letter requesting that anybody who has fairy tales, send them in. It didn't matter, Jakob said, if the stories taught a lesson or were just fun to listen to, whether they were happy or sad. What was important was that the person writing down the story should capture every word the teller said, even if the story didn't make sense the way that it was told. The Brothers Grimm certainly were not the first scholars to ever think of recording folklore, but you could argue that for their time, they were the best. A lot of other recorders of the time would only take very vague notes on the original orally told story, and then it was accepted practice for them to embellish, change, and sometimes entirely make up the rest of the story from that baseline. They could make the stories do whatever they needed them to do in order to confirm their scholarly intent. The Brothers Grimm, however, were comparatively far more mindful, although that's not to say that they didn't change anything. For example, in the original Snow White, the orally told version of the story, the evil stepmother was actually Snow White's mother, but that didn't quite fit in with what the Brothers Grimm were trying to do, and they firmly believed in the goodness and purity of the role of a mother, so they changed it from being a wicked mother to a wicked stepmother. And while that is a significant change, it doesn't really change the message of the story all too much. Plus, the convention of the wicked stepmother was something that they saw in other tales, so it wasn't a particularly difficult or a seriously transformative change to make. So they certainly did change things, but they really worked hard to preserve what they saw as a story's essential truth. Wilhelm Grimm once compared it to cracking open an egg. When you crack open an egg, there's always going to be a little bit of white that gets left behind in the shell. It's inevitable and you could try and scrape it out, but you're just gonna lose some of it. But what's important is that the yolk stays intact. And especially compared to other scholars of their day, the Brothers Grimm were really mindful of keeping the truth, that yolk of the story, intact and discernible even in their rewritten stories. By modern standards, they editorialized a bit, and it's hardly a spot-on, first-hand account, but especially in the context in which they were operating, the scholarly work that the Brothers Grimm did was groundbreaking. One scholar who wasn't quite so concerned with maintaining integrity was an old friend of the Grimm brothers, Clemens Brentano. Brentano had also been working on a fairy tale compilation at the same time as the Brothers Grimm, but his work was far less precise and mindful. In fact, some of the storytellers that the Grimms approached had had previous encounters with Brentano, and whatever he did, they were so scarred by the experience that these storytellers refused to share their tales with any other scholars, including the Grimms. Still, the brothers wanted to hold on to that friendship, and so when Brentano requested a copy of their manuscript for him to examine, of course they gave it to him. Fortunately, they did make a separate copy of the manuscript before they handed it over, which was good because Brentano took that manuscript and never gave it back. In fact, it went missing for decades and was only fairly recently found. Despite trials and disagreements and a whole lot of work, in 1812 the Brothers Grimm published Kinder- und Hausmärchen. The title translates to the Children's and Household Tales, and it contained 86 of their collected stories. And although this was called Children's Tales, it was not originally intended to be a book for children. Rather than having illustrations or etchings, the stuff kids kind of like to see in their books, this book contained footnotes and assiduous notes on all of the stories and where they came from. Jakob explained that although the book very well could be enjoyed by children, it was originally intended as a serious scholarly pursuit, intended for adult consumption. This was a misconception that would continue to reoccur throughout the fairy tale work of the Brothers Grimm. While children really enjoyed the book and they devoured the stories, a lot of the educators and adults in their lives were a bit more skeptical. Not only was the book dull and illustrationless, it was also, throughout most of it, incredibly dark. There are some seriously bloody and brutal moments in those stories that you could argue are not acceptable for children. In fact, there's one of the stories that I'm going to share later on that was deemed so brutal and horrifying that it was cut by the Brothers Grimm from later publications of their books. Jakob would remain steadfast in the idea that this book was not intended for children and that it should not be adjusted to pander to them. It was written to be a scholarly preservation of German culture. Wilhelm, however, did begin to change his mind over time. Wilhelm had always been a bit more of the romantic between the two of them. Jakob was very much dedicated to the facts, and Wilhelm was more interested in larger spiritual truths. And he was willing to pivot their work to cater more towards a younger audience. This is something that would be a bit of a point of friction between the two of them when they were working together, but on the second collection of fairy tales, Wilhelm would have the chance to pivot their intent however he liked. 1812 was a really rough year to be Napoleon Bonaparte. The French were facing defeat in Russia, and higher-ups like King Jerome were beginning to see the writing on the wall. He began to pull out of Kassel, and while they were trying to work on the second book, he kept Jakob very busy collecting up German books and art to smuggle with him as he fled for France. And once Napoleon's defeat was finalized, Jakob was kept even more busy with politics. He was sent to Paris from 1814 to 1815 to recover German art and literature that had been taken by the French. It was during this lengthy separation that a lot of the work was done to compile the second edition of Grimm's fairy tales, meaning that most of it was done under Wilhelm's hand. And as always, when the brothers are physically separated, we get a lot of very angsty letters where they're getting upset about miscommunications due to just how long it takes to get a letter from France to Germany. The second volume, when it was published, wasn't quite the smash hit that the first one was, but it did a lot to establish the Brothers Grimm as the voice in German folklore. The brothers would be reunited in 1816, and fortunately, they would never be seriously parted again. They would continue much of their work together, editing and recompiling fairy tales, exploring German folklore and history, and doing some groundbreaking work on the study of the German language. In 1825, Wilhelm would marry Dorothea Wilde, one of their former next-door neighbors who had contributed stories to the first volume of Grimm fairy tales. Jakob would never marry, but he did live out the rest of his life in the same house as Wilhelm, Dorothea, and their 4 children. Over their years, they spent time as librarians, professors, and members of the Academy of Sciences, and in 1838, they began work on the Deutsches Wörterbuch, the most comprehensive German dictionary ever created. Wilhelm passed away in 1859, and Jakob would carry on after him just 4 years later, but they left behind a remarkable legacy, be it their linguistic studies, their scholarly practice, and of course their preservation of German culture at an incredibly volatile point in history. Adaptations like the Disney princess movies, loving satires on the original fairy tale stories, and yes, even the edgy, gritty 2010 dark fairy tale remakes, none of these would have been able to exist without the groundwork laid by the Brothers Grimm. And yet, there are a lot of stories from these collections that aren't quite as well known, but they can tell us a lot about the values that these tales wanted to promote, the questions and controversies around them, and how these stories were crafted and changed throughout time and space. Let's begin with my new favorite ever fairy tale, The Mouse, the Bird, and the Sausage. This story begins, as so many do, with a mouse, a bird, and a sausage getting together and buying a house. And at first they are experiencing domestic bliss. They each have their own special jobs. The bird goes out into the forest to gather wood. The mouse stays home and takes in water from the well, starts the fire, and sets the table. And the sausage, of course, does all of the cooking. And as a final step to all of the cooking, he takes his little body and slithers through the food to season it so that it's perfectly salted every time. It's just the perfect setup, and they've got an excellent thing going. However, one day, the bird gets talking with another bird, and that other bird is like, hey, to me, it looks like you're doing most of the work in the house. Because after they finish cooking, the mouse and the sausage get to relax. They don't have to do anything, but it's the bird who has to wake up early in the morning and spend all day gathering wood. The bird insists that they try and change jobs for a day, And so they draw lots to decide who's doing what, and their fate is sealed. The sausage goes out into the wild to gather firewood, and the results are disastrous. Not far from their home, the sausage had encountered a dog. Now, this dog had considered the sausage free game and had grabbed him and swallowed him down. The little bird arrived and accused the dog of highway robbery, but it was of no use, for the dog maintained that he had found forged letters on the sausage, and therefore the sausage had had to pay for this with his life. With the sausage dead for his so-called crimes, the bird flies home to find even more chaos. The mouse had been making dinner, and since he had seen the sausage cooking, he knew that the final step was to slide your body through the vegetables. But the mouse isn't greasy enough, and he gets stuck halfway through, and he burns to death between the potatoes. When the bird returns, he can't find the mouse anywhere, so he throws the firewood all across the floor so that he can search for the mouse. But the firewood then catches on fire, and the whole house is consumed in flames. The bird rushes to the well to try and get a bucket out, but the bucket falls in and pulls the bird in behind it, and the bird drowns. Truly, you can learn just so many lessons from this story. You don't carry forged papers. Cops might eat you if you're an anthropomorphic sausage, and you really shouldn't try and slip and slide through a pan of hot vegetables if you aren't greasy enough. And perhaps, most importantly, you shouldn't change up a good thing. Although it may look like it, the grass is not always greener on the other side. And even if it looks like your friend has the easier side of things, it might not go so well trying to walk a mile in their shoes. I will be honest that I first read this story because it had a mouse in the title, and you guys know how I feel about rodents. But I've been thinking about this story for days, and I need as many people as humanly possible to hear it. And maybe a great way for me to get the word out about the mouse, the bird, and the sausage would be to build it its own platform using this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website building platform that's going to allow you to stand out and succeed online. Using their cutting-edge design intelligence technology, you can build yourself a beautiful website and unlock your creative potential, creating something that perfectly matches your needs. Your Squarespace site is going to be there to do whatever it is that you need to do, including creating and selling your own courses. Start with a layout that fits your brand, upload videos, and customize everything with their next generation editing technology. You can even put those courses behind a paywall if you want, with a one-time payment or an ongoing subscription. You can even raise funds and donations directly from your Squarespace site. They give you a dashboard to access donor contact info and history, everything that you need conveniently in one place. If you're interested in creating a new brand for yourself or updating an existing one, you should give Squarespace a try. Just head on down to squarespace.com for a totally free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/JessOfTheShire to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. So, the mouse, the bird, and the sausage is, I can admit, ridiculous, but this next one is not, and it is very gruesome and bloody, so if you want to skip it, go ahead to this timestamp. In the story titled How Some Children Play at Slaughtering, we meet a couple of 5- and 6-year-old kids who are playing butcher together. One of them is the butcher, the other is the assistant who's holding a bowl to catch the blood in, and then one of the children is cast as the pig in this game. Imitating the butchers that they've watched, they pin down the pig, cut its throat, and collect the blood. One of the townspeople sees what has happened, and they panic, and they grab the kid who has done the murdering and take him before the local court. There, they just have no idea what to do until a wise man suggests that the judge presents the boy with an apple and a gold coin. If the boy took the apple, he was to be set free. If he took the coin, he was to be killed. The judge took the wise man's advice, and the boy grabbed the apple with a laugh. Thus, he was set free without any punishment. In the first edition, this was followed up by a part 2, which is somehow even more brutal, so I'm not going to share it here. But that story was deemed so gruesome that it was taken out of later editions of the Brothers Grimm stories. It only appeared in the very first publication. And this was actually something that Jakob himself protested heavily. Apparently this was one of the stories that had come from the mouth of their own mother, and Jakob remembers that after hearing the story, he certainly played a lot more carefully. There definitely was value to the story. And while I get why you probably wouldn't want kids reading that one, I think that in the original intended context of it being a collection of folk stories for adults, it makes a lot of sense to have that story in there. While it is a warning to children to play carefully, it's also a really interesting exploration into the culpability of children. At what age does a child become fully responsible for their actions? At what age should their conscience prevent things like that from happening? No one likes to consider the fact that children can do really terrible things, but sometimes they do. And this story presents something very interesting. The child is allowed to choose between an apple, the instant gratification and sweet treat of an apple, versus a gold coin, which is something that an adult would certainly choose over an apple. And the child chooses the apple, meaning that in all likelihood he just didn't understand the seriousness and the adultness of the act that he was performing. It asks questions about who is accountable when a child does something wrong. Is it the butcher who allowed the children to watch as he slaughtered pigs? Was it the child himself who had no comprehension of his action? Or was it maybe even the parents who probably should have been watching their kids a bit closer? This isn't a fun story, and it's probably not one I'd, bring to story time at the local library, but it does what the best stories do. It asks questions that provoke us to think further. Our third story is way less brutal, and that is the tale of the old woman in the forest. It tells of a servant girl left all alone in the forest after her employers are killed by robbers. She cries and cries, thinking that she's going to die out there, but then she's saved by a dove holding a key. The golden key unlocks a nearby tree where she finds an entire cache of delicious food. She eats, and when she grows tired, the dove brings her another key. She unlocks another tree to find a beautiful bed for her to sleep in, and another tree where she finds a whole wardrobe full of beautiful clothing. After many days of living in luxury in the forest, the dove asks her for something in return. "I'm going to lead you to a small cottage," said the dove. "You are to go inside, where you'll find an old woman seated right next to the hearth. She'll say good day to you, but you are not to answer her, no matter what she does. Go past her to the right, where you'll come upon a door. Open it, and you'll find a room where there'll be lots of different kinds of rings lying on a table. You'll see magnificent ones with glistening stones, but you're to leave them alone. Pick out a simple one that will be lying among them, and bring it to me as fast as you can." The girl hastens to obey, enters the home, and ignores the old woman, even as she screams at the girl to stop. And finally, she makes her way into the room that the dove described. While she was looking for the ring, she noticed the old woman slinking by with a bird cage in her hand. The woman was about to make off with it, but the maiden went up to her and took the cage out of her hand. When she lifted it up and looked inside, she saw a bird with a simple ring in its beak. She snatches the ring and runs, but returns to find her dove nowhere to be seen. While she's waiting, she leans against a tree, but suddenly that tree begins to move. Its branches wrap around her, and when the girl turns around, she finds that the tree has become a handsome young man, and the two embrace. He explains that he is actually a prince, and that him and his servants and his entire house have been turned into trees by the Wicked Witch. He was able to become a dove for a few hours every day, but so long as the old woman had the ring, he was trapped. by stealing the ring, the girl has freed him, and they ride off into the sunset together. That story is really interesting to me because although it is certainly unique, it contains so many very familiar fairy tale elements. Helpful birds can be seen in many different fairy tales. The image of a child lost in the dangerous woods is pervasive. That child breaking and entering a witch's cabin is practically a staple. And of course, the girl saving the prince and turning him human can be found in many tales, but to me, it rang most similarly to the classic tale of Beauty and the Beast. Now, what's interesting is that Beauty and the Beast is not German. It is a very specifically French story with some Italian influences, but it's definitely not German, which is really interesting that either it has influenced this story or this story has probably influenced it. Either way, there is some kind of cross-cultural bleed there. Now, I'm not trying to say that the old woman in the forest is like fan fiction of Beauty and the Beast or something, but it is some kind of proof that although they didn't necessarily know it or acknowledge it in their time, the stories collected by the Brothers Grimm are not solely German in origin. And I do think it's worth examining if that's important, and because a lot of people think it is, why that is so important. In their exploration on the Brothers Grimm, Alfred and Mary David explain, all the labors of the Grimms, whether in philology or in folklore, stem from a basic premise that they share with most of the major figures of the Romantic movement. There is a spiritual force in nature that finds expression in literature. Nature means not only external nature, mountains, forests, lakes, but human nature, which responds to these things. The ancient poets, the Grimms and their fellow romantics felt, had lived closer to nature, and their works were therefore imbued with fundamental truths and values. These truths and values had been given their noblest embodiment in the ancient epic poetry, much of it lost, but they still survived in the humbler form of the folk tale. There was a belief that only intensified over time that coming from a more ancient, like primitive, more connected to nature time, these stories contain some kind of German quintessence. That by studying and popularizing these stories, they would find some kind of overarching national identity to which they could cling. Now, that's not entirely inaccurate. These stories told by a particular people and region are significant, and of course they warrant study, but consigning anything to belong specifically to any one nationality can be a bit of a slippery slope. For example, very classically German things like Wagner's Ring Cycle and the stories of the Brothers Grimm were adopted and upheld by particular movements of the 1930s and 40s that I can't name or else YouTube will block this video. Suffice it to say, trying to claim that anything is quintessentially German and defining what values make someone quintessentially German or quintessentially any nationality, you risk alienating people that don't specifically fit into that mold. It also means that stories like The Ring Cycle or like the stories of the Brothers Grimm may be written off by people who, for whatever reason, don't want to engage with things that are German. Specifically in the case of the Allies in World War II, they specifically avoided things that were considered very German, and that included the tales of the Brothers Grimm, despite the fact that the tales of the Brothers Grimm had nothing to do with the certain political movements that had taken over Germany. And what's really crazy is that these stories aren't even technically German in a lot of cases. First off, Germany didn't exist when a lot of them were being told and collected, and stories don't really respect arbitrary borders. That's like expecting rivers or wildlife to respect the arbitrary lines that we draw on maps. In fact, a lot of the storytellers that contributed things, especially for the first volume of Fairytales, they were actually French people who just a couple of years before had migrated over to Germany, so they weren't even technically German, whatever that means, because it's a human term that we have applied to stories, but the stories themselves do not obey those labels. You can find crossover and influence from stories from all across Europe in the tales of the Brothers Grimm, and you could probably make fair arguments that there are international stories sprinkled in there. Some things are a bit universal. While the idea of a sausage sliding his body through the vegetables to season them may be admittedly quintessentially German, the concept of a little girl lost in the forest is universal and can be found in the stories of almost all, if not all, cultures. On his essay exploring the idea of ownership and the Grimm fairy tales, Donald Haas explores this idea very thoroughly. That essay is linked in the description, along with a lot of other very interesting discussions revolving around the Brothers Grimm. But he dispels the idea of a story being able to be owned by a single nationality, because first off, that's a dangerous and limiting way to look at stories, and second off, stories rarely actually respect international borders. But even then, the alternative to that, sometimes people swing a little bit too far in the direction of universality. Okay, so if stories don't belong to a single nationality, if they don't belong to America, or to England, or to Germany, who do they belong to? You could say they belong to all of us, that the folk in folktale is all of humanity, and that stories like fairy tales contain some kind of universal human value. But the problem with that is, what are those universal human values? I think that internationally we can all kind of agree that children with knives isn't a good call, but beyond that you get into generalizing and stereotyping that just doesn't really encompass the full breadth and variety and diversity of the human experience. So we're left in a place where the nationalistic definition doesn't satisfy, nor does the concept of universal ownership. In both cases, fairy tales are supposed to depict or prescribe for us what is true, as well as what forms of behavior are typical, normal, and acceptable. Whether we view them as yours and mine or as ours, fairy tales read from these perspectives confine and limit us, narrowing our views of reality while allegedly giving us greater insight into the other, into ourselves, or into humanity. From these perspectives, fairy tales own us. We don't own them. I do find it kind of unfortunate that this is a conversation that has to happen at all. But the idea that a story can be owned by one specific person has become so prevalent over the last few centuries. The idea of copyright has had a huge impact on the art of storytelling in that we feel the compulsive need to assign ownership and to consider the ownership of everything. It can't just be a collection of fairy stories, it is the Brothers Grimm collection of fairy stories. It is Disney's Cinderella, it is this actor's show, it is this author's book, it is this producer's movie. Ownership is important, obviously. It matters who originally told a story and what their intent was, but that can't be where our consideration of a story ends, because the moment that a story leaves one person's mouth and enters another person's mind, it is changed. It is the egg being cracked open. Even if all of the pieces are still there, it will never quite be the same. It is totally fair to attribute that specific collection of fairy tales to the Brothers Grimm, and even to the larger country of Germany, but that cannot be where our consideration of these stories ends. Donald Haas explains. So, who owns fairy tales? To be blunt, I do, and you do. We can each claim fairy tales for ourselves. Not as members of a national or ethnic folk group, as French, German, or American, not as nameless faces in a sea of humanity, and not in the Disney model as legal copyright holders. We claim fairy tales in every individual act of telling and reading. It is by this process of continual transformation that stories stay alive. Without Shrek, I bet a whole generation would never have heard of the Muffin Man. Without Disney's Snow White, the tale of Snow White may be just as obscure as The Mouse, the Bird, and the Sausage. And without the Brothers Grimm collecting, preserving, and retelling these stories, we wouldn't have this entire plethora of beautiful, educational, and imaginative fairy tales that we have today. I honestly think I might perish if I try and get through a video without talking about Tolkien a little bit, so I wanted to bring up one of his storytelling concepts, and that is the idea of the cauldron of story. Speaking of the histories of stories, and especially of fairy stories, we may say that the pot of soup, the cauldron of story, has always been boiling, and to it have continually been added new bits, dainty and undainty. A story is not an individual incident. It is an ongoing process. Once it has been put out into the world, a story drops down into the cauldron where it simmers away, breaking into its component parts, exchanging flavors with the tales that lay around it, until a new teller wants to spin their tale, and they dip into the pot, take out these older elements, reform, reshape them, repurpose them, and put them back into the pot once the new story is told, the same as it ever was, but irrevocably changed by time and by the complexities of the human mind. Tolkien mentions many stories that have found their way into the cauldron, the tale of King Arthur, of Fafnir, and of Sigurd, and of course, the classic fairy tale. I wish to point to something else that these traditions contain, a singularly suggestive example of the relation of the fairy tale element to gods and kings and nameless men, illustrating, I believe, the view that this element does not rise or fall, but is there in the cauldron of story, waiting for the great figures of myth and history, and for the yet nameless he or she, waiting for the moment when they are cast into the simmering stew one by one or all together, without consideration of rank or precedence. The important part of Tolkien's cauldron of story is not necessarily what's put in, or who put it in, or what their reasoning was. What's important is what we take out of it. And that means that it's really impressive when we find something like the Tales of the Brothers Grimm, something that has been in this cauldron for so long, but something that continues to prove itself to be flexible, timeless, and significant. Because it is tales like that that will continue to flavor the stew of our imaginations for generations to come. You guys know that I absolutely love researching highly specific and kind of random topics, and putting together this video was an absolute blast. I pretty much didn't know anything about the actual Brothers Grimm going into this, and they had incredibly interesting lives, and there's a lot of stuff that I wasn't able to get into in this video. So if you want to learn a little bit more and do a bit of research yourself, I highly recommend checking out anything by Jack Zipes. He's written a lot of stuff that was hugely helpful for putting this video together, and his translation of the Grimm tales is top-notch. So go ahead and check that out. I will link a couple of things in the description, and then of course my sources are also in the description. In the comments, let me know what your favorite Brothers Grimm fairy tale is, especially if it's one of the more obscure ones, but I mean, who doesn't love the classics? I think my favorite, other than the mouse, the sausage, and the bird, is probably Little Red Riding Hood, because I've always been a big fan of cloaks, and also because we had that really creepy 3D animated movie Hoodwinked on DVD as a kid, and that kind of imprinted on my mind like I'm a baby duck, and I still think about that movie a lot today. I am planning on hopping on the Patreon this weekend to do a little cozy read-through of some more of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. We'll pick a couple. I might do it with the rats so that I have somebody to read to other than the silence of my own mind, But if you're interested in that, my Patreon is linked right below. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I really love making videos about Tolkien, but I really like making videos about other stuff too, and it means the world that you guys are here supporting me, even when I'm doing slightly more out there topics. And I hope that you have a very happy Hobbity day.